Hi, folks. Thank you for joining us. We're going to wait another minute or so till a few people come on in. I think we'll have more people join, but why don't we just get started to make sure we have plenty of time? And my name is Risa Shimoda. Thanks for joining us today. You have joined the second of three webinars or meetings with the River Management Society and the National Park Service about hydropower topics for practitioners, whether you're just beginning to work on hydropower or maybe you've worked on it for a while. I think you'll find you will have found the whole series to be interesting, and particularly today because it's a very new topic or newly anticipated topic. We're going to be talking about the valuing of hydropower in a changing energy landscape, and we have National Park Service worker Kevin Lewis, Dave Steindorf from American Whitewater, and Dr. Makun Sun and Tyler Phillips from Idaho National Laboratory. So we thank those guys for working hard to put this day together. And I'm going to hand it over to Kevin to get us started.
Thanks, Risa. Okay, so I'm going to lead this off with a short, like a 20-minute presentation, and then we're going to kick it off to the other folks for a longer presentation, more in-depth presentation. So I think just to get started, there's my quick then and now about the energy landscape of this country. You know, it is rapidly evolving. 25, 30 years ago, energy generation in this country was really dominated by large thermal plants, nukes, coal and oil. Today, a lot of those plants are gone and have been replaced with renewables, wind and solar, and really coming on strong now is battery storage as well. And the addition of new renewable generation is increasing every year. In fact, I just read a new resource plan from the Northwest Power Energy Power Coalition. In the next 20 years, the load in the Pacific Northwest is going to double, but that's going to be all met by wind, solar, and batteries. So, you know, we're not building new. I mean, they are building a little bit of new hydro here and there, and you have some pump storage that's being proposed, but in general, hydro is hydro, and it's what we've got. But what's going to make up the difference over the next 20 years is wind, solar, and batteries, and maybe something else. So does hydropower have a role in the energy market? And I would say absolutely, but it depends on the project. You know, hydropower, if you've got storage capacity, you know, you can operate in one fashion, or run a river. You basically either operate on what's coming in, or you don't operate at all and you just release the water down the river. I mean, those are your two options. The dependability of stream flow makes a difference. The seasonability makes a difference. So, you know, hydropower, not all hydropower is the same. You know, every project's a little bit different. I think as a practitioner or working on a project that you'll need to understand how the particular project you work on, how it operates, and what its constraints are. Let's see, let me get down to. So a little quick stuff. This is from the FERC website, and it basically shows all the different power markets in the U.S. There's 10 power markets, including Texas, which is ERCOT, which is a little bit odd because ERCOT is just within Texas to avoid being regulated by FERC. All the rest of the power markets are regulated by FERC, but ERCOT is not, so they're a bit of an outlier. But if you can find this page on the FERC website, you can scroll down and you can look at all the different power markets. It describes what they are, and you can click on them. And So no matter where you are, I think it gives you an opportunity to go look and become more familiar with the power market that is in your region and how it operates. Um, One place I did find that was useful was this website's wholesale electricity and natural gas market data. And this is interesting because it covers 8 different regions. Down here, you can see one of my little cursors on, and you can have a choice. You can download uh, an Excel file of the current year to dates, or you can go back and do historical. If you do historical, you can find 2001 through 2013, then individual years from 13 to 24. So the data is available out there if you're interested in and what the how the market operates in your region. Um, and let's see, looking over at, so this is the California ISO, and I use it quite a bit myself because it actually shows me the entire West. It's not just California. This is live, so you click on buttons, and you can see what the actual power price is on all these different nodes all across the West. And at this moment, I mean, even here in Idaho, wholesale price of power is minus $4.26 a megawatt hour. And that pretty much is through the West right now, real time. In California, it's even more than that until you get over to the far West Coast where you actually shift and like you're looking at $50 a megawatt hour. And that difference is probably more so in not being able to move the power from where it's cheap to where it's expensive. Uh, that's kind of a problem with the West. But for you, you know, as a practitioner, uh, it's good, and you can use the California ISO. You can come up here to this region and you can look at the different regions, and so all these different regions operate within the ISO. So it's very useful. Um,
Hey, Kevin, I'm going to jump in for a second. When you
sure.
either now or as you're going from tab to tab or when you're done, could you put the links in the chat?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll find a way to. I'll do that
maybe when
when
you're done, so you're not,
I'll do
in
that when I'm done. Yeah,
control. Yeah.
definitely. And so for an example from the previous slide, um, let's see. So from this slide here, instead of clicking on this and just getting a raw download, we can look at this is the data for the hub that relates to me. I'm in Boise, Idaho. So Mid C is one of our trading hubs up here in Mid Columbia. And this is the daily power price for the first quarter of this year. Um, and it's got lots of data here, but I would look at the weighted average price. And you can see that like back in the first of the year, you were running $50 a megawatt hour up and down. And as you scroll down through the winter, for some reason here at the end of January, power jumped to $234.75 a megawatt hour for one day, which is pretty high. And then it kind of went back and forth. You actually went down, and now as we got down towards the end of March, power started coming down 30s, 20s. Then all of a sudden, at the very end of March, you were at $6, $4. So what's happening at the end of March? The snow started to melt, the sun's coming out, and the days are getting longer. So you're getting more and more solar, you're getting more and more hydro. So you're getting more power generated and less demand because it's not as cold. Therefore, the power prices drop. And if you average out that whole column for that first 3 months, it averaged out to $50.48 a megawatt hour. So these are the kind of numbers you can use in your area when you're working on a hydro project, because basically at the end of the day, um, mitigation that you're looking for on a hydro project costs money. So it's how do you figure out how that costs money? So um, basically, you know, flow equals dollars when you go through through a hydro project. And the challenge that I had and Dave had 25 years ago or 30 years ago is this information really wasn't available. The Cal ISO was just getting started at that point. And when we were negotiating the license, we had to kind of take the word of the utility on what something would cost. So if you wanted, in-stream flow for fish and wildlife of a certain amount, they calculate the cost of that, and they say, well, we can't afford that, or we can't afford that, or not. Or if we ask for whitewater releases for recreation, they would come back and say, well, no, a weekend of whitewater releases is going to cost us $50,000. And we really had no way to counter that because to them that was all proprietary information. We started to see that through the Cal ISO that we could start seeing the real-time price of power, and we realized that on weekends in the springtime in California, the price was going negative. So it's like, well, it's hard to say that the price of the whitewater release would cost you $50,000 if the wholesale power price is negative. In fact, you'd be better off to put the water back in stream than putting it back down the river. So that's kind of what started at least my process of trying to figure out the power markets, how people could determine, get a better idea, or at least be able to make a good argument as for why what you're looking for mitigation is reasonable. So the Cal ISO was a great thing. I think the only thing I would say when I talk about the energy picture in the West, right now the great equalizer, when you look at all these different power prices around, and as the day goes on, power in California will continue to go negative until it's substantially negative. In other places, it'll be positive. And what would be the great equalizer when you looked across the West? And to me, it's this. Uh, this is actually the page where you can go order your own Tesla Megapack. It's $1 million, so it's a little spendy, for most of us. But you can go order one of these things today, and in reality, if you have a small hydro project that's run of river, and so you either have to generate or you're just turn the water loose down the river and not generate. To me, it would make a lot more sense if you had several of these megapacks next to your powerhouse. And when the price of power is going negative, you're charging your own battery. When the price of power goes back up, you're sending that power back to the grid. To me, it's a more efficient way to operate your project. So getting down to what I really want to show you. And so this is something I built 25 or 30 years ago when I was trying to figure this out. And Dave and I have used this for a long time, and we give it away to people. We'll figure out a way to put this up so people can download it. It's just a simple Excel spreadsheet. And what you can do, so in a hydro project, you need to know really three things. What's the capacity of the powerhouse? What's the flow at that capacity? And then really what's the current power rate that's going on? And that's what you use here. So if you had a 120 megawatt powerhouse and the flow was 3,700 CFS, first off, this tells you what the generation per cubic foot of water is, 100 cubic feet, 1,000 cubic feet. Here's where you would input your flow. Say if you wanted, in this case, we wanted 250 CFS, but the in-stream flow requirement was already there for 125 CFS, and you wanted a release for 4 hours, then this computes out basically that 250 CFS minus 125 for that period of time. You can input the current wholesale power rate here, and this will give you the rough cost of that release. And this is very general. It's not like completely scientific and doesn't include like cost of transmission lines and everything else, but it's a way for a person working on a project to get an idea of what what it might cost the utility to say, leave the water flowing over a waterfall for 4 extra hours in the afternoon for aesthetics or something like that. So it's just a really quick and easy tool to help calculate the cost of water, basically going through a powerhouse or not going through a powerhouse. Um, the other thing is just converting flow to acre feet was just a simple tool I use, but this is definitely available for anybody that wants to use it for any reasons. Um, and I think that's pretty much covers what I'm going to do. And I'm going to turn it over to Dave to talk about what goes on after this.
All right, thanks, Kevin. And I think Tyler's going to go throw up our slide deck there. There we go. Yeah, thank everybody for coming here today. Yeah, this slide just shows the same thing that Kevin was talking about. You know, what we're seeing out there in markets. This is from a webinar that we did last year, which really covered a lot of the changes that have been happening out there. And this just is from a day last year when we did the presentation. It shows middle of the day power prices there on the left were at negative $25.73 a megawatt hour. And by later on that evening, prices were at over $50 a megawatt hour. So it's a $75 a megawatt hour price swing. And what Kevin just showed is, a basic tool that you can use that's, you know, relatively accurate if you're looking at a project that's just providing baseload power, running at a constant generation. But as we know, the hydropower industry correctly points out that one of the values of hydropower is its flexibility. Well, if you're using that flexibility, just using an average power price really doesn't accurately reflect the value of that project. And one thing that we've struggled with um, in my experience in relicensing is trying to figure out a way to measure and value that flexibility so that we can make good decisions about how hydropower projects are operated. You can't you don't know what you don't measure. I often say that using average power prices is like saying that you want a vacation on the moon because the average temperature is 70 degrees. That doesn't make sense. You're either boiling or you're freezing, right? But this tool, if you want to go and throw up the next slide, Tyler. Uh, this tool has been in development for a couple of years now. It's been a partnership between um, members of the Uncommon Dialogue, American Whitewater, Idaho National Labs with funding from the Department of Energy. So this team has come together to develop this tool so that we can actually use at least hourly pricing data to come up with a more accurate value for hydropower projects and really be able to measure the flexibility of power projects, which is why it is called the Hydropower Flexibility Evaluation Tool. And with that, I will hand it over to my partners in this project, Tyler Phillips and McCoon Sun.
Thanks, Dave. Um, my name's Tyler Phillips. I'm with Idaho National Lab, and today I'm going to be presenting on the Hydropower Flexibility Evaluation Tool. Um, First, we're going to give a presentation and talk about some of the motivation. I think Dave just kind of hit a lot of the motivation. A lot of us have diverse backgrounds, so I'm just going to talk briefly about what optimization is, and then some of the tool optimization. So what do we actually consider in there? And that will be also listed in the assumptions and limitations of the tool. Then we'll look at a case study with different flexibility at a site. And then we can have questions and answers on the presentation. Then we'll move on to a live demonstration of the tool and how to run it, and just show some different simulations with different constraints. And also, if you want to see things like recreational or seasonal flows, how you would put that into the tool, and then how we can compare those other simulations easily. So a lot of this is kind of what David just talked about. For the motivation, we really set out to design an easy to use optimization solver. If anybody's tried to do optimization before, The solvers can become pretty complex pretty quick. So we wanted to make it easy to use, and that was, a big focus the whole time when we were developing it. And, Dave and Jeff helped a lot on how we can keep it where it's useful, but also easy to run. And some of the main drivers were really just understanding how different scenarios for relicensing can impact the revenue. And the big ones would be the ramp rates and the minimum flow constraints that have to be met. Um, we also wanted to consider seasonal flows and recreational flows. So if those are part of the requirements, they can be put into the tool, and we can still see the differences between different types of scenarios with those. And it is a web application tool. And one of the things that we needed with a web application tool is it needs to run in near real time. So nobody wants to go to a website and, input their information and click an optimization button and then have to wait for 3 or 4 hours to get any results back. So we need to keep that to run pretty quick within a few seconds. And then we also wanted to be able to inspect and compare those different scenarios. So briefly, I'm going to just kind of talk about optimization in a real nutshell. And I promise there's no math in any of these slides. So really, optimization is just the process of making something as effective as possible. And the goal then is to find the best possible solution from a set of possible choices. And to do that, you have to, or you are allowed to adjust the variables that adhere to a set of constraints. So mathematically, what happens for optimization is you set some objective, and then that's just a mathematical formula, and you either want to maximize or minimize that result. And again, it's able to um, change a set of variables, and we define those, and those variables then have to adhere to a set of constraints. And then there's a solver that goes through and mathematically solves that objective function, changing those variables with the constraints set on them. So for the tool, we want to find the best dispatch schedule to maximize the revenue. So mathematically, our optimization function is just the generation times electricity price. And I told you there wasn't an equation, but that's the only one. So it's pretty easy to follow. Um, and the constraints, so the things that we are able to constrain are the ramping rates. So how the flow release, how quickly that can ramp up or ramp down. And then any minimum flow release. So any flow that's required to go through at any given time. And the variables then that can be adjusted are the dispatch, so how that water goes through the hydro generator. And we also have spill. So if there's certain constraints set where there's more water than the hydro generator can take, there is a amount of spill that can also happen. And we do a pre-processing step. And the main reason is to keep the optimization solver fast and to make solutions what I consider more possible. So when you start putting scenarios with different ramp rates and different minimum flow releases, and you do input a file for how much water you have coming in, there may be no possible solution to meet those constraints that you gave. So we try to do a pre-processing to make sure that that solution is possible. Some assumptions and limitations of the tool. So um, a big way that the optimization solver is set up is water is conserved each day. So we look at 24-hour period of the amount of water that goes through from the input file, and that amount of file from, or that amount of water released from the input file to the optimization will be the same on any given day. And the big reason for this is we don't need to track reservoir levels. So we're only shifting throughout periods of the day. So um, we're not conserving water for a month later when prices are high. We only shift it throughout a single day. Um, Because of that, run a river may not be possible, but Kevin hit on a key point, especially with batteries. Um, we wouldn't be able to shift the power, but we would be able to shift where we actually sell it. So it would be applicable to a run-a-river plant where batteries were installed. Um, Other assumptions, the generation output is linear with water discharge, and so we do not track the head level. There's no efficiency curve for the generators and no minimum generation, so any amount of flow results in some amount of generation. We do hourly time steps like Dave had talked about. We want to, do things at hourly time steps instead of large mean values over days or weeks or months. But since we do hourly time, we can't resolve anything sub-hourly. So if some of those constraints or ramp rates are shorter than an hour, we can only do them on an hour basis. And we don't consider ancillary services or the real-time market, and multiple units or cascading is not supported. So the pre-processing step, one of the main ones is when we look at minimum flow, we want to set that as a hard constraint. And there's two reasons. The first, well, first of all, a hard constraint must be met. So for an optimization, you can set constraints as hard constraints or soft constraints. Hard constraints have to be met, and soft constraints can be broken, and a penalty added to the objective function. We could have put it as a soft constraint, but then users would need to be able to put a penalty. So, for example, if you said the ramping rate was 300 CFS per hour, the optimization could go above that to 400, but it would come at some penalty, which is a cost, and you would need to input that cost, what it is. So we would just need more information from the user, and then it becomes a lot more computationally intensive as well. So we went away from that, and what we did was we found a way to make sure that those constraints can be met and kept as hard constraints. So an example would be if the daily flow constraint, if the daily flow was a constant 500 CFS, and I tried to impose a minimum flow constraint of 550 CFS, there clearly is not possible because there's not enough water for that day to meet that constraint. So we do a pre-processing step and we go ahead and adjust that constraint to a feasible solution, which in this case would just be 500 CFS. The tool is a web application. You can see the interface on the right. Currently, it is ran locally, but we will have this out as a public tool in the near future. There are 3 different file inputs, one for the flow data, one for the price data, and another for the minimum flow constraints. And that can either be a file or a constant. So if you don't necessarily want to go through generating a file that matches up with the flow data file, you can just go ahead and put a constant value in there, and it's easier for the user to run that way. But the file allows for things like seasonal flows, recreational flows, or different flows through different hours of the day. And the next part is just some inputs. So just like Kevin and the tool he had needed, we do need to know what the nameplate generation capacity is and what the maximum flow through that generator is, and the ramp rates that we want to impose on that. So after we run the optimization, there's a lot of data, so I just wanted to make a slide once to kind of talk about some of the things that we'll look at when we're running the tool. And if for starters, we can look down at the bottom and left, and the blue is the daily flow in acre feet each day, and that is from the baseline, which is from the input file. And the red is from the optimize. And what we can see is that each day the flow remains constant, whether it's the baseline that we input or the optimization. So we're not shifting, it's just a check to make sure we're not shifting water from one day to the next. And since we did have a much lower flow And on this example, I put a minimum flow constraint of 100 CFS, and that is this purple line. And on January 21st, again, there was not very much flow. It would not have been able to meet that criteria of 100 CFS. So it does relax that constraint down to 79 CFS. So if we weren't doing that pre-processing step and I tried to run this optimization, there would be no solution because it would not be able to meet that constraint on that given day. So that's one of the big reasons we do it, to make sure that, again, we have feasible solutions. We can inspect the data to see when our constraints weren't able to be met and what those look like. The other things that we want to point out is just, again, the minimum flow constraint of 100 CFS. And it might be kind of hard to see. The optimization is this yellow or gold line. And so at any given period, it does not go below that minimum flow that we input. And we gave it a ramp rate of 200 CFS. So it's only able to ramp up at 200 CFS over each hour. And the blue is the price. So you can see that the optimization is trying to take advantage of the high price hours. Where the total discharge, this is just from the file that we input. There are these multiple peaks. And so for this optimization, we didn't take into account some of these recreational flows that may be imposed on this hydro unit. And we can do that if we use the input file. So a case study we wanted to look at is, how does generation flexibility impact the revenue? And we wanted to just test different ramping rates. And we did 100, 300, 500, and 700 CFS. And the maximum flow was 1200 CFS. And then we also want to note that the results can be very location dependent. So don't take this and think that this is going to be something at each location. But if we look at this and maybe just think about what we'd expect for the revenue differences to be, do we expect them to have the same jump? Obviously, we would expect the more flexible we allow it to be, the more it's able to take advantage of the higher prices quicker. But an interesting result that we see is this blue line is the cumulative revenue throughout the year. So we do see a increase, a fairly substantial one, when we do the optimization, even at 100 CFS ramp rate, a big jump between the 100 and the 300, but then very small jumps after 300 to 500 and 700. So just something like this would be able to let us quickly evaluate how much that additional fast flexibility impacts revenue, and maybe find a good place between revenue and the impact it has on the environment, or ecological effects for those ramping characteristics of whatever location we're looking at. And that is it for the presentation. If anybody has any questions at this time.
Actually, Tyler, let me just make a comment before we go to questions. This is very much it's a beta version of the tool. I'm sure many people out there are thinking, well, I'd like to have a tool, but I'd like to be able to do this piece or that piece. Those are in development. Our goal here was to get a tool that would give us the basic building blocks out there that we all typically encounter: minimum in-stream flows, ramping rates, and then coming up with pricing information can be different in different regions, as Kevin pointed out earlier. We're also looking at getting forecasted pricing information. That's some work that some of the other labs have been doing. While it's good to look at where we are right now, certainly pricing scenarios with more storage coming online, things like that are going to change in the future. So those are all things that we're looking at. So big message there is, don't assume that what you see now is like as far as we plan on going with this. That's the important thing. And the other one is, we would caution people, hopefully I'm not getting ahead of what you're going to show here, Tyler, but to not use these dollar number values as absolutes. What's really important is the relative difference between the different values out there. We wouldn't want somebody to look at this and say, okay, this is exactly how much the utility is making based on this generation. As we all know, going through relicensing and you're looking at different flow scenarios, you really want to know the relative value and relative cost of different flow scenarios, in-stream flow scenarios, and what their impact would be. So again, it's really the relative difference that's important and not the absolute value.
Yeah, really good input, Dave. Thanks for that.
You have this slide up, Tyler, so let me just address this and then we can go to some of the questions because there have been few. So, because we're looking at this lovely picture of Dave 20 years ago. The,
Thanks for
the
that.
third,
Thanks for rubbing that in.
the third um, in our series of webinars is going to be, it'll be a few weeks from now, a little bit more than a month from now. And Dave's going to be back with Kelly Catlett from American Rivers and Kevin Mendick from the National Park Service, talking about effective processes, and we'll go through kind of a classic view of the relicensing process, like the flow chart and the steps and ways in which practitioners can get involved. And then kind of juxtapose on that how you really can be effective while being involved. And that's where this just show up comes. And it's often the case in any kind of project where lots of people are involved, and it takes a champion in order to make things happen. So thank you for that. And maybe we could just go to having folks' photos up, and I'll just go through some of the questions so far. They're from Matt Terry. This came up, Kevin, during your talk. What type of turbine is your spreadsheet applicable for? France's turbines can be tuned to optimize generation at different flows and are not linear.
I'm not sure if I can answer the question, actually. A lot of I mean, he's absolutely right. You can do that. I think this tool is more coarse than that. It's not as fine as optimizing the turbines, because you have to do something completely different in that respect. So this is more for projects that they're either on or off, which is a lot of the older projects you find out there. They may have 4 different turbines, and they'll turn one turbine on, then later on they'll add a second turbine, add a third turbine, add a fourth turbine. But most of those just run at one flow, one speed. So I'm not sure I can answer any more than that.
Well, and I just add on, that was one of the limitations that Tyler highlighted with our tool, is that we're not able to, at this juncture, to have um, uh, generation curves. But I would assume at some point we'd be able to input that into the tool so you could actually have a more accurate picture of generation, because the generation profiles are not linear, right? Individual generators have particular characteristics of how they output energy. But Matt, it might be down in Ecuador, it'd be different there. But here, I mean, it's a pretty close approximation for what you're going to get. Again, it's more about the relative differences and look at these things than absolute numbers.
Yeah, I think Dave, like the efficiency curves as well, like it is going to make a difference in what the revenue shows. So we're not trying to, give you an exact dollar value of what those hydro units are producing. It's the relative difference between, ramping rates and minimum flow values. And it is something that we could add into the tool, and we would like to as we move forward with it. But additionally, as you start making optimization solvers higher fidelity, they become very computationally expensive pretty quick. So instead of being able to run them in just a few seconds, you have to, weigh the considerations of maybe getting, a percent or two closer to the true value, but instead of running in 2 or 3 seconds, you're running in 15 or 20 minutes. So there's that trade-off that we consider as well.
And Tyler, can you unshare that screen so I don't have to look at my former self any longer?
So another question from Matt, what type of software platforms do industry hydro operators use to optimize their generation slash revenues? Grid operators or dispatchers, question mark?
I, Somebody here from industry want to tackle that one? I mean, I know of some tools like Plextos and some other things, but maybe somebody else here might be able to answer that. I know there's a variety.
If you like to respond, you can just take yourself off mute, or if that sounds complicated, raise your hand. Anybody want to help?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. I will say, from an operational standpoint, that's used in an operating room is different than the optimization that we're doing specifically here because they also consider, forecasted flows and forecasted prices, where for the optimization that we're looking at, where we do more of, you input the entire year data up front. So it does come out with a quote unquote perfect dispatch, um, which means that, we didn't forecast prices and store water for multiple days in advance, knowing that an expensive um, um, energy price is coming, which the optimization that we're doing does. In reality, you don't really know when those expensive prices are going to happen.
And can I touch on that for just a minute? Yeah. So for again, simplicity of a beta model, we're using the existing flow throughput through a facility as our water availability. That's what Tyler described. That's how much water we could use. Now, again, ultimately, what makes sense to me is that you would have this tool that you would actually get that water availability from an operations model that has been developed for a relicensing for a project. It would say, this is how much water you have each and every day based upon, water year type, reservoir storage, etc. Um, and that, again, that would be in development. I don't think that would be a huge step. It would just be really shifting how we're developing a water budget here to a water budget that's actually developed via some kind of operations model. Um, but again, in development, we don't have that just yet.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I'm adding a couple of points here. So a little bit background. So this hydropower flexibility evaluation tool. So originally the structure is based upon like an in-house model. That's the Pacific Gas and Electric PG&E developed internally to feel like some, yeah, their needs. So that's the original model we have. And the inspiration of that is to like replicate this analysis, which like a PG&E already in which PG&E already have like a buy-in to this relicensing context, and also in a manner that we could like be easily and portable for other utilities and hydropower sites to use. So just want to add this background here.
So I have a question, you guys. What's your vision of the ideal kind of profile of use of your tool? If everyone was using your tool 10 years from now, who would that be and how would they be using it ideally? What's your dream?
McKun, do you want to answer that?
I think
I
you can go first. Yeah, I will.
I I can dive into that. So
Yeah.
currently, my experience in doing a bunch of it and working, my colleagues at American Whitewater, Tom O'Keefe, Jeff Venturino, who's been a huge help in developing this tool and way smarter on the technical aspects than I am. Currently, my experience in relicensing for projects that have flexible generation and can provide those important services when it comes to this topic of trying to describe that to reach relicensing outcomes, we do a lot of what I call arm waving, which means the licensee will say, well, this is really important. And then the other stakeholders will say, how important? And they'd say, very important. Well, can you measure that? Well, it's a lot. And so we never get down to any way to quantify the flexibility. Now, and why it may seem inelegant to use dollars as a measure for that flexibility, it's really the best thing we have. Because if you're optimizing the project, and using a project that is flexible, what you're going to try to do is maximize the revenue. So until we come up with a flexibility unit, dollars seem like the best way to use that. So that's thing one to your question, where he says, give us the tools to quantify this value so we can make better decisions in relicensing. Thing two, and I brought this up in my presentation last year. I don't know if there's anybody here from FERC, but FERC has described their developmental analysis that they use in relicensing to me as perfunctory. That is a huge problem if their economic analysis doesn't reflect reality, because one, they look at it, what was described to me like, well, we're always going to relicense the project. We're not going to not relicense it based on the economics. That's fair enough. But all of the balancing that's done for a project is measured in dollars, whether, as Kevin pointed out earlier, a minimum in-stream flow, a ramping rate, flows for recreational release, that's all measured in dollars. Well, if those dollar numbers are erroneous, that means that all of your balancing is incorrect. So the second important constituency that can use this is going to be FERC. And I think it's going to be important for FERC to look at how they do that analysis. And our hope is this is a tool that they would be able to use in the future. And that's also why I think it's really important to have Department of Energy's engagement here, because this is a tool that we're developing with members of industry and others, so that everybody can get behind a single platform that we think is going to help us to get the answers that we need.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, adding on the top of what Dave just mentioned, I feel like because right now we're developing this tool, we haven't like tested, receiving like feedbacks from our stakeholders. So I think like our short-term goal is to having some success, adoption of the revenue and the flow scenario trade-off model can be used like in hydropower relicensing and the relicensing conversations. And then for the medium term, we hope that it can be like utilized by our stakeholders, like in the multiple relicensing process to communicate trade-off between parties. And then what they mentioned, like that's our final goal. We hopefully like FERC can use this tool to replace the current revenue calculation in the environmental assessment. So that's our final goal to, yeah, for this tool.
Thank you. I have a really super basic question. Are there not parameters or bases for being able to test different ramp rates, like constraints on what the facility can do in other ways? Or can any plant test ramp rates from 50 to 1,000 or something like that? You know what I mean? Just whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, as far as a tool perspective goes, like we can input any value, because again, it's just going to be a mathematical formulation that it's going to optimize. In practice, though, obviously your plant or the generation unit will probably have some sort of constraints where you can or can't reach those. So you wouldn't, in practice, be able to go to 1,000 or down to 50 or something of that nature. But
Mhm.
as far as the tool goes, you can input any value.
Yeah, yeah. I'm thinking more of the plant because there are little plants and there are huge plants, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
I think Melanie asked about when will it be available.
Oh.
Coming to a theater near you,
Soon.
We're hoping to have something out and available this summer. And I would I haven't really run this by the rest of the team, but I would think we would probably have some kind of a training exercise where we can actually get together with people um, on a webinar and have people using the tool and just walk through how to use it. Because one thing to look at it on a screen, it's another to sit down and actually use it. And I don't know, Tyler, well, we'll talk about that, about how to structure that, but I can see where a training would be helpful and necessary.
Yeah, for sure. I think that even, I mean, the tools, it's pretty easy to use, but I think having a webinar and a training would be great and valuable.
Easy for you to say, Tyler.
You didn't say you had to do it, Risa.
That speaks to Matt. You know, he was saying, could you run through a scenario? That would be
Yeah.
awesome to do that at some point.
Well, that's next.
Hmm.
Yeah.
We got,
Should we
I
move
mean,
on
today.
and look at it?
Yeah.
Is that we're ready to? Okay. In the slideshow. Can everybody still see my screen?
Yep.
Yep.
Great.
Yeah.
So again, this is just ran locally on my computer, but this will be at some point available to the public and put on you would go to maybe hfvt.inl.gov and be able to find this webpage. So we just give a little bit of introductory text, but what we really want to look at is the optimization. So we will come in here and see the first thing that we do is select the hydropower generation type, and the bypass reach is currently being developed. So we don't have that yet, and that would be one of the features that we hope to have in the near future. But just like I showed in the slides, we have 3 different potential file inputs and then the constraints we put on a system. So I have some flow data and I'm going to open it, and I'm actually going to show you what these data files look like. So, and it is a very easy hourly flow data over almost a year. So this one starts on the 6th, and I don't think it goes the entire year. It goes till the 27th. But you can see it's just date times and what that discharge was in CFS. And I'm just going to show you the price one real quick as well, since I have this open. Again, we have dates and then each hour of the day, what the price was. I did make it so if you have the same format with hourly date times and one column of prices, it will work with that format as well. So you don't have to try to get it into this specific format. We tried to make it fairly flexible for inputs. Okay. And for the price data, let's go ahead and put that price file in. Oops. Flow data. Price data. And I'm just going to use a constant value first and say that the minimum flow is just 50 CFS. For this flow file, the maximum discharge is about 1200 CFS. And then we can select whatever ramping rates we want. So I can just put in 500 to start and go ahead and run the optimization. And it runs relatively quick. It only takes a couple seconds. And again, since the price file was actually an entire year, but the flow file started on the 6th, so it truncates based upon the inputs that you give it. So it will tell us that this actually was 355 days and 23 hours of data. And the baseline revenue is just taking the flow data that we input and the price data. So that is what the baseline of everything is. And then the optimization shows the difference between the optimization solver and the values that you input. And so the first plot we have is pretty much all of the data. So we can look at prices and just pick maybe a high priced area and I'm going to look at the baseline generation. So again, we can see that it's actually doing a pretty good job taking advantage of where the prices are high. And we can look at the optimized generation, so how those are different. It is going to have a higher peak, and it takes really advantage of these higher peak prices. Sorry that they're the same color, but there's a lot of data in here. We can go through and inspect all of it that we want. But really what we want to look at is the revenue differences. So we can see on any given day or where throughout the year those increased revenues occur. And the last thing is we can look at is for the optimization solver again, it does conserve water each day. So we can look at the baseline and the optimize and see that they're the same. So again, we know it's just shifting water through different periods of the day and not from one day to another. And this last plot is the green is where the optimization, this is the difference in revenue between the optimization and the baseline. So where the optimization is generating more money or actually losing money. And you can see that, periods of the day where we expect higher prices, the optimization is generating more money and it's losing money here because it's actually not running the hydro generation during low priced hours. And that's how you can run the tool. Again, we can maybe check a different ramp rate really easily and just say, what about the difference between 500 and 700 and run it. And it went up about 100,000. So the ramping rates, once we reach a certain ramp in this with this input and this price file, it seems that the increased revenue it gets pretty diminished once you get above about 400 CFS per hour. So we can run lots of different scenarios pretty quick and easy. But one thing we want to do is be able to compare them as well. So we did have a comparison, and I'm going to just look at 4 different scenarios. And one thing that we were interested in looking at is this flow versus flexibility. And I ran 4 different ones, and we are going to look at low flow. So if we have a minimum flow of 50 CFS, but since the flow is low, the flexibility is also low. And then we just move up to medium low flow of 75 CFS. So we're required to always have a higher flow, but we increase the flexibility. So let's just compare all 4 of these together. So I'm going to
And just sorry to jump in, Tyler,
go ahead.
where the second number there is a ramp rate per hour increase and or decrease, just so people know what that flex number means.
Yeah, the first one is the minimum flow that's required. And then the next one is the ramp rate that was the constraint of the ramp rate that was placed on that. So we can go ahead and look at those 4 different scenarios that we ran. And what we actually see is the highest increase of revenue happens to occur with a baseline flow of 75 CFS and a flexibility of 400 CFS, and that should be CFS per hour. But a higher minimum flow, and even though we're able to ramp all the way up or all the way down in an hour, doesn't result in as high of a revenue as this one with a smaller flexibility, but a lower minimum flow constraint. And yeah, we just have plots between the price and then how each one of those are the generation units are ran throughout the year, and the revenue, and then the cumulative revenue that we can look at.
Okay, and I'm just gonna say this because I'm sure there's somebody out there like, but I don't like that result, right? This is just an example, that we put together the specifics are going to depend on your project and your hydrology. And again, it's not the absolute numbers, but the relative difference between these numbers that's going to be important. So if you say, well, we think from an environmental perspective, this is really important to have a higher minimum in-stream flow versus a ramping rate. Now you can actually evaluate the relative cost between those different scenarios to see what you think is a better solution out there. So again, this is just an example. Your results may vary, just like your stock portfolio performance. So yeah.
Okay, here's a question from William McDavitt. What assumptions are made regarding either about the volume of stored water or about limits to head pond water surface elevations in this tool?
So we don't one thing that we do to make it run quick is we do not consider the amount of volume in a reservoir. And since we're not shifting water from one day to the next, we're not making big fluctuations if there was a reservoir compared to the input flow file. So what you discharged on a given day remains the same. We just shift it through different periods of that day. Um, because of that, we also are not taking into consideration the head height. Um, so we do not have that in there as well. So we, again, assume a linear um, generation between just the flow and the size of the generation unit. Again, those can be put into the tool and it will just take longer to run and can become, more complex for a user. And I think, if we want to get too complex, there's other tools that may be better suited for that are already built. So we're trying to find a good place where for usability and for practical output for us to have good ideas on the difference between what revenue and what environmental constraints are going to do.
And this is, I mean, feedback that we're going to be looking for are what are components that we really need to think about developing that are going to make the tool really useful. And like most things, there's going to be the categories of nice to know versus need to know. To Tyler's point, we could do a lot of nice to knows, but it's going to make the tool more cumbersome, run slower, etc. So really, what are the key features that we know that we're going to need? And as I said earlier, I think having the tool be able to talk to whatever operations model you're looking at to look at things like storage. So you can do more than just shift within the hours out of a day. You can shift water seasonally. That we know that that's going to be a key component that we need to be able to look at in the future. Along with, I mean, the bypass reach one, I think is really important because most of the projects out here in the West are bypass reach projects, but that does add a fair bit of complexity as opposed to looking at projects where you're just generating out of the base of the dam. But we know that that's something for this to be useful across a broader landscape of projects. That's something that we're going to have to look at.
I have one more question if nobody else has one. This is so basic, it's embarrassing, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. So the significance of looking at ramping rates, is it that a power company would like to ramp up to 100% of whatever they're going to be used to generate at, and that usually isn't good for other reasons? So it's important to look at other rates versus going from 0 to 60 in 1 second. Um, because that would be the quickest way to start generating power now. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Oh,
I mean,
why the importance of looking at this gradation?
well, as we saw, like in Kevin's presentation,
Mhm.
being able to adjust to the grid needs quickly is really important. We have a lot of variable renewable resources out there now, and so that's a need to be able to respond. sun stops shining, the wind quits blowing, we need to have resources that can counteract those things out there. So that's on the grid side. On the environmental side, there's tons of literature out there that shows that some resources don't do well with very quick fluctuations in
Right.
flow.
Yeah.
But there's also a tension there. Is the way to fix that having a higher minimum in-stream flow
Mhm.
or a lower minimum in-stream flow and a faster or a slower ramping rate? And so with this tool, you could kind of work that to the middle to find out what is an optimized solution of that tension between minimum in-stream flows versus ramping rates. And then again, you have to input, what you think are the important biological resources. And again, to be clear, this tool isn't saying anything about what the biological resource needs. This just gives you the tool to actually be able to measure the flexibility value of a project and to actually put some numbers to the math so that you can hopefully make better decisions.
Right. I think everyone else here knows that. I mean, knows what I was asking about. So you didn't have to explain it at the beginning. So
No,
that,
it's a good question. The only
no,
dumb questions are the ones that don't get answered.
yeah. Okay, Matt, Terry again. Can you explain why the tool is not applicable for run-of-the-river hydro projects? It seems like the analysis is subject to the constraints imposed by the flow versus input.
Since we're shifting water throughout the day, if a run of river is kind of going to have to generate when that water comes, it's not able to shift it from the morning to the late afternoon, would be why it's not applicable to run a river. However, like Kevin mentioned, if we did potentially put a 4-hour battery on that run a river asset, since we're only shifting through periods of the day and not, several months, it becomes actually a pretty good tool for looking at what a battery would do on a run a river asset and taking advantage of price arbitrage throughout the day.
Mhm.
I think what batteries bring to the story is their speed at which they can ramp up or ramp down. Battery response is in milliseconds. A turbine response is in more seconds. And milliseconds really count. A turbine is a giant rotating mass, and you get it up to speed. It wants to stay at speed, so it's quicker to adjust than a thermal plant. But when you throw a battery in there, batteries pretty much kick everybody's butt as far as response time.
And I think Jeff kind of nailed this response in the chat, but Tyler, I mean, you could use this tool for a run of river application, but it's just going to be, you're not going to be varying the flows. The flows would only vary, you'd set a minimum in-stream flow that's basically constant throughout the day, and then you could see what that impacts. So it would allow you to say, okay, what is the cost of turning this peaking facility into run of river or whatever you decide you want to do. I mean, you'd have to think about what you want that flow input file to look like depending upon the project. But do I have that right, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could still use it for certain aspects of Run a River. And I mean, some Run a River do have small amounts of what do I say, storage, where you may be able to, have periods of lower release and wait. And depending upon the input flow file and the minimum flow file, you could, constrain your system to follow what is possible for that hydro facility, and then you get really valuable feedback. But I don't think, just taking an optimization solver that's going to say I can run this run a river at zero flow for 12 in a 12-hour period might not be realistic for a lot of run a river facilities. So as long as you set up the constraints correct with the minimum flow file, yes, it's definitely more applicable to a run a river, but it takes maybe a little bit more knowledge of the system and fine tuning.
And
Good. Good,
and
Dave.
William, just quickly answering your question, yeah, I've actually um, talked to John, who was involved with Brookfield in developing that tool. I think their tool is very similar, although it wasn't designed to be applicable across projects. I think there's a specific, but there's a lot of intersections between that tool that they developed and what we're looking at here.
Yeah, thanks for William. Thanks for that 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 link to that document. Any other questions, comments, concerns, enthusiastic appreciation?
We'll take that.
Yeah, and I guess one of the comment is, the tool will be openly available to the public, and we will do whatever to try to get a link to you as soon as that is available, Risa. And I don't know
Mhm.
the best method for that to be shared with anybody that's interested, but or you can reach out to myself or McCune, anybody that's interested, and we can also let you know when it is or becomes available.
Yeah, we can definitely share it. We can put it on our website, our hydropower resources website. And
Yeah.
what about um, a longer term timeline on the bypass portion, Tyler? Is that in the works, on the way? We're thinking about it. Not sure.
Yeah, maybe I can answer this question. So for the bypass reach, right now we're in the phase one of this
Okay.
project. We're also applying for like additional funding to finish like the bypass
Mhm.
reach. But we just put like put that bypass reach there. We have something, but we haven't like fully added that there.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So that means like when the tool will be released online, you will only see like the current feature we show. We don't have the bypass reach on a fully online version at this
Mhm.
moment. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So not this spring. I'm
Yeah.
just kidding. I'm just kidding.
July?
Wow.
Okay. Well,
I
if there are no
do
other questions, anyone, any other
I do
comments?
think the bypass reach is kind of the next thing that we would like to add. So before we look at, different head levels or generation curves, I think bypass reach is the first thing that or the big addition that will be next in the tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this is really exciting. And thank you both. Well, thank you all of you for sharing what you've been working on, and the perspective also, Kevin, from what you've been, the manual tool that you've been using for a long time that's worked really well. And thank you everyone for attending. We'll let you know when there's a, oh, let's see. Any chance you could include an option to incorporate compensating reservoirs? One more question.
The compensating reservoir.
Matt, do you mean a re-reg reservoir? Is that what you're talking about?
Pump storage.
I think he means, are you,
Yeah, what I often come across projects that have an off-channel reservoir, which we typically refer to as a compensating reservoir, which allows them to, and these are typically associated on run-of-river projects and areas that have some type of constraint on having regulation capacity on their intake, on their primary intake, and it's kind of used as a battery in some sorts. It gives them a small amount of regulating capacity, and helps them address issues with like sedimentation and stuff like that by having a holding pool where they can draw water from that's cleaner with less sediment directly to turbines. And it just, as we've been modeling these types of projects, it adds another loop of complexity because it gives them hourly regulating capacity and it's variable. So
And
it's
so are they pumping into this, Matt? Is it like a small pump storage component of a project?
yeah, I mean it's basically in line on their water conduction. It's they'll divert water from on a run a river project, they'll have a diversion structure. They divert that water and it runs and it fills up a small holding reservoir, and from that holding reservoir they will use that to uh, connect the pin stocks to, and they'll just, they'll generate from that holding reservoir. They'll use that as their, um, as their source, for generating. And we've seen a lot of issues with cavitation because it's complex for them to operate those things. They'll get an air bubble into the penstock and blow the whole project up. Um,
That's a problem.
so yeah, it's uh, yeah. So but in terms of modeling that, that's always been, you know, kind of complex for us to deal with uh, because of that, that variability that it represents. But it's kind of similar to the idea of a bypass channel or something, though. I mean, it's getting into that same,
Yeah,
genre.
it seems like you almost would look at it as a bypass reach and use the diversion as part of the reservoir. I mean, you lose a bit of head going from the reservoir into that canal and down to wherever you have widened another reservoir, but it's
Yeah.
almost like you use it as a bypass reach.
Exactly. Yeah, I think, yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to simulate it as. But yeah, um, but yeah, that's what we're seeing a lot with that. And then I guess we'd also it's has some similarities maybe to pump storage, but that's a different ball game too. But we're seeing a lot of pump storage projects in different areas as well. But um, that would allow them when they're not generating, instead of releasing or allowing spillover, they would pump water up to a holding reservoir, um, for later use.
And Matthew, when you say we, who's we and where are you? Or the projects you're talking about?
Well, I'm located down in Ecuador, but I have feet in many different places. I'm often called upon to address projects in countries all around the world. Um, so it's just kind of what we're seeing on the forefront everywhere with new hydro development that we're seeing, and we're trying to see how we can address um, um, those issues, right? And yeah, that's so I think so important to understand what what processes we have in North America and the United States, because of the access we now have with information and the type of people that are working to evaluate these problems. It's very helpful for applying that in other areas because we're dealing with the same hydro developers that built you know the dams in the Grand Canyon, and most of the people that are that built the hydro projects that are existing in the West. They are alive and active all around the world developing new projects. So it's good to to stay up to date and be on par with them, to be able to engage with them adequately, right?
Yeah, thank you. So, but maybe, your question may be able to be addressed with the bypass
I mean, I
component.
think
Maybe
that,
that'd be something for you to keep in the back of your mind, you guys, as you're
I mean,
working.
it sounds like if I understand what you're describing, even as long as you have a mechanism to come up with the water budget through the project, again, and this tool right now can only deal with that on a daily basis. But if you have that daily water budget, that it comes out of an operations model or something, you should be able to use this tool. Do you think that's right, Tyler?
I would say yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's another thing about the tool where, a lot of optimization solvers where it's going to allow you to shift water from one day to another. A lot of feedback we've got from people too is that, with the perfect foresight of an optimization, you're overestimating potential revenue. But if we're not allowing water to shift from one day to the next or a week later, this is something that, is a little bit more realistic in that respect, but we don't have a lot of the high fidelity other things in the simulation that those do. So I don't know if that answers your question at all or not, but I think how it's set up and the system that you're describing seems like it would be, something that should be fine to run through optimization solver. And like Dave said, it has to do with, the water that ran through on any given day. And since you've already done that with past data, the optimization's just going to say it can be, that amount of water can go through, and you still have the maximum flow of the generation unit that can be exceeded.
Mhm. And in many cases, they can't. I'm looking at the Cal ISO supply graph right now, and prices are negative, yet there's still 910 megawatts of large hydropower that's being generated right now.
Which kind of
Clearly,
doesn't
they
make
don't have
sense.
any choice other than to generate. Otherwise, why would they be doing it? It's costing them money. So, so I don't think using an existing um, flow profile is that far off the mark. Again, it gets you pretty close to where you have to assume that their generation would be radically different, and it can be different depending upon water year types. But for some reason, their generation would be different, or your flow scenario would change their generation profile. So that's where, again, having an ops model and a water balance generated out of that ops model would be really helpful. But again, that's things to come.
Okay. Matthew, are you out of questions? You get one more if you want.
I said, I think we've trimmed the group down.
I think so. Yeah.
Have we trimmed the group down?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We bored them to death.
No. No, well, thank you, all you guys and gals, the folks who are listening and have been viewing. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for all the work on this tool. We'll look forward to it being unveiled publicly. So please share with that. If you have any questions later, feel free to let us know, and we'll get a recording out to you. I'll also share the chat, when we send out the recording, because there are some good questions that aren't answered in the recording. Okay, thanks
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye.
Bye.